Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, May 4th, 2023. The former leader of the right-wing group Proud Boys, Enrique Tarrio, and three other members of that group convicted by a federal jury of seditious conspiracy in connection with the attack on the U.S. Capitol January 6, 2021, and the attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power following the 2020 presidential election. Coming up, reaction from Attorney General Merrick Garland, and we talk with Politico's senior legal affairs reporter, Josh Gerstein. The Senate Budget Committee holding a hearing on the House Republican bill that would increase the U.S. debt ceiling to avoid a default in as little as 2 months and also cut federal spending. It was a hearing called by the Democratic chair, principally to criticize that bill and advocate for a clean debt limit increase. Senator Bernie Sanders introducing a bill that would raise the federal minimum wage to $17 an hour. The Senate Republican Leader Mitch McConnell says now is the time to get permitting reform done to speed along the approval of energy infrastructure projects. U.S. rejecting completely Russia's accusation that the U.S. was the mastermind behind an alleged drone attack on the Kremlin that Russia says was a Ukrainian attempt to assassinate President Vladimir Putin. And Vice President Kamala Harris meeting with the CEOs of the company behind the AI chatbot ChatGPT, plus Google and Microsoft, to talk about the risks of artificial intelligence. President Biden stopping by that meeting. We'll get the latest from the White House press secretary. And we start with the conviction of members of the group Proud Boys of seditious conspiracy over the events following the 2020 presidential election. Attorney General Merrick Garland talking from the Justice Department briefing room in Washington.
Today, the Justice Department secured the conviction of 4 leaders of the Proud Boys for seditious conspiracy related to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. In addition, those defendants and a 5th member of the Proud Boys were all convicted of felonies, including obstructing Congress's certification of the 2020 presidential election results and conspiring to prevent Congress and federal officers from discharging their duties. The evidence presented at trial detailed the extent of the violence at the Capitol on January 6th and the central role these defendants played in setting into motion the unlawful events of that day. Today's verdict makes clear that the Justice Department will do everything in its power to defend the American people and American democracy. Since the January 6th attack, the Justice Department has conducted one of the largest, most complex, and most resource-intensive investigations in our history. We have worked to analyze massive amounts of physical and digital data. We have recovered devices, decrypted electronic messages, triangulated phones, and poured through tens of thousands of hours of video. We have also benefited from tens of thousands of tips we received from the public. Following these digital and physical footprints, we were able to identify hundreds of people who, often masked, took part in the unlawful conduct of that day. I am grateful to the department's prosecutors, FBI agents, investigators, analysts, and others who have worked on these cases with extraordinary diligence, skill, integrity, and courage. Over the past 2 years, the department has secured more than 600 convictions for a wide range of criminal conduct on January 6th, as well as in the days and weeks leading up to the attack. We have secured the convictions of defendants who fought, punched, tackled, and even tased police officers who were defending the Capitol that day, who crushed one officer in a door and dragged another down a flight of stairs, who attacked law enforcement officers with chemical agents that burned their eyes and skin, and who assaulted officers with pipes, poles, and other dangerous or deadly weapons. We have secured the convictions of defendants who obstructed the certification of a presidential election, as well as the subsequent criminal investigation in the events of January 6th. And now, after 3 trials, we have secured the convictions of leaders of both the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers for seditious conspiracy, specifically conspiring to oppose by force the lawful transfer of presidential power. our work will continue. At my Senate confirmation hearing just over a month after January 6th, I promised that the Justice Department would do everything in its power to hold accountable those responsible for the heinous attack that sought to disrupt a cornerstone of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power to a newly elected government. And as I have said repeatedly, the department will conduct all of its work in a manner that adheres to the rule of law and honors our obligations to protect the civil rights and civil liberties of everyone in this country. Today's verdict is another example of our steadfast commitment to keeping those promises. The Justice Department will never stop working to defend the democracy to which all Americans are entitled.
Attorney General Merrick Garland at the Justice Department in Washington. Joining us on the phone is Josh Gerstein, Senior Legal Affairs Reporter for Politico. Thank you for being with us. You tweeted that this is a major victory for the feds. Why is that?
Well, there have only been a few trials on this issue of seditious conspiracy. It's sort of widely seen as the most serious charge that has been brought in connection with the events of January 6th. 2021, there have been a lot of charges brought. There's 1,000 people who have been charged with things ranging from trespassing all the way up to this offense of seditious conspiracy. Several hundred people have faced charges of trying to obstruct an official proceeding, meaning obstruct Congress's meeting that day to tally the electoral votes. But really only a handful of people have been charged with the seditious conspiracy, which is considered a more significant offense, really aimed at not necessarily the overthrow of the U.S. government, but a real effort to interfere in the operations and the execution of the laws of the United States.
What type of penalties does it carry?
It carries up to 20-year penalties. The other obstruction charge that has been brought more routinely also carries theoretically a 20-year penalty, but it's not usually applied in anything close to 20 years in cases where you have obstruction that is non-violent. So it depends on, I think, the actions of the individuals involved. It's not common for defendants to be sentenced to anywhere close to the maximum on any of these charges.
This trial took several weeks. I want to read a line from a Washington Post article. In wrapping up the 14-week trial, both the government and the defense framed the jury's deliberations as an existential test for U.S. democracy. So in a larger sense, what was the meaning of this trial?
Well, I think the meaning of this trial has to do largely with whether people thought of what happened on January 6th as a kind of a spontaneous event of people that essentially got carried away after coming into town for a political rally, or was this a deliberate act that had been planned in advance? Any kind of planning is technically sufficient to make it a conspiracy. It could have been planning just moments before some of these actions took place. But the theory that the prosecution laid out here was that for weeks, the men involved in this case, the so-called Proud Boys, had been organizing through meetings and also through online chats to carry out violence on January 6th. The defense lawyers said, there was a lot of hyperbole and rhetoric in these chats. Many people say things online on social media and then don't back it up with actions. And it shouldn't be assumed that statements that were being made about looking to cause trouble or mess people up were intended literally. And the defense also tried to argue, look, this was a political group that was supportive, at least up till that point, of then President Trump and was involved in a political movement. There were also arguments that these individuals came to Washington looking to protect themselves and others against potential violence by left-wing radicals, so-called Antifa. And that was sort of what the jury had to decide. The most interesting part of this case was Enrique Tarrio, who was the chairman of the Proud Boys, at least at that time, was charged with seditious conspiracy here and convicted, even though he was not in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. So that is a new development in the various numerous prosecutions that have been brought over the Capitol riot.
We're talking with Josh Gerstein with Politico. As these trials are continuing and the verdicts are coming in, do guilty verdicts against these defendants, has it been changing public opinion about what happened on January 6th, the interpretation of it?
I do think that the sheer volume of cases has contributed to a general sense that there were a lot of people that acted criminally on that day. Among folks that have sort of hardcore beliefs one way or another, it probably has not had a lot of impact. There are people that are supportive of the January 6th defendants who believe they have been overcharged, that it was, as I said earlier, more or less a protest that got out of hand, and that the charges that are being brought are disproportionate to charges that have been brought against other acts of political protest, even some which intended to disrupt either committee proceedings or floor proceedings in the House or the Senate. Obviously, it's not routine for that kind of protest to lead to people being charged with criminal obstruction of Congress or seditious conspiracy. And so I think that debate about whether people have been overcharged will continue, although it should be noted that the most serious punishments that have been handed out so far are really on people who personally committed violence, attacking police officers, and wielding weapons on January 6th. Those are the ones who are looking at the serious sentences of 7, 8, or 9 years in prison.
Josh Gerstein is senior legal affairs reporter for Politico. You can find his stories at Politico.com and on Twitter at Josh Gerstein. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Congressman Benny Thompson, Democrat from Mississippi, the former chair of the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, tweeting, "The guilty verdict against the Proud Boys reaffirms that in a democracy, the rule of law prevails. No one is above the law." And a tweet from a former member of the committee, Eric Swalwell, Democrat from California, "More jail Codels from McCarthy's MAGA morons." Codell referring to congressional delegation, and McCarthy is House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. This from Associated Press. Senate Democrats pressured Republicans on the debt ceiling impasse Thursday, focused in a hearing on what they say will be painful reductions in government services if a bill recently passed by the House becomes law. No one expects that the House bill, which would importantly increase the nation's borrowing authority as well as cutting spending, will reach the president's desk. Democratic Senate won't let it. Many Republicans admitted so when passing the measure, but they said action by the House was necessary to get President Biden to the negotiating table with Republican Speaker Kevin McCarthy. A meeting at the White House with congressional leaders of both parties is set for next week. That from Associated Press. Here's part of the hearing. Budget Committee Chair is Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island, questioning two witnesses, Mark Zandi, Moody's Analytics chief economist, and Abigail Hopper, Solar Energy Industries Association president.
Mr. Zandi, we are being presented by House Republicans with curtain number 1 and curtain number 2. Behind curtain number 1 is default. You have assessed that as financial calamity, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That's the word, yeah.
It would pitch us into recession.
Severe recession.
Severe recession, and it would cost perhaps 1 million jobs.
That's a short period of default, yeah.
Correct. Longer period of default, much more job loss.
Correct.
Behind curtain number 2 is Speaker McCarthy's what we call Default on America Act. You assess the economic harm to America of that bill, if it were to pass, as also very severe, correct?
Yeah, it would put the economy on the brink of recession, if not in recession, yes.
And knock $141 billion off of our GDP.
Correct. Close to 800,000 jobs.
And nearly 800,000 Americans would lose their jobs if this bill were to pass.
Correct.
For the record, the MAGA extremists in the House who were essential to McCarthy's speakership have said that nothing less than the default on America option will pass. Just so it's clear, those are the two options that the extremists in the House are now presenting us. Ms. Hopper, in simple terms, layman's terms, what becomes of the American solar industry if the Default on America bill were to pass?
If the Default on America bill were to pass, or as you call it, all of the investment that we anticipate, both in solar deployment and in solar manufacturing, would not take place. So the 50 gigawatts of investment, the over 100,000 jobs in solar manufacturing alone would not happen.
Would it be fair to describe that as crashing the American solar industry?
It certainly would be fair to describe it that way, and it would also be fair to describe it as just gutting the vision of rebuilding the domestic manufacturing base here in the United States.
Abigail Hopper, Solar Energy Industries Association President and CEO, and former Director of Maryland's Energy Administration. Question by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island, the Budget Committee Chair. You also heard from a witness at today's hearings, Mark Zandi, Moody's Analytics Chief Economist. Mark Zandi also telling the committee that he estimates that without a debt limit increase, the U.S. government will run out of money to pay its bills on June 8th, with the worst-case scenario that it would be June 1st, and the best-case scenario will be August 8th. Another member of the committee, Senator Mitt Romney, Republican from Utah, said no one wants the U.S. to default on its debt, but at the same time, budgetary changes need to be made to avoid future escalation of the debt. Here's Senator Romney questioning another witness, Brian Riedel, Manhattan Institute Senior Budget, Tax, and Economics Fellow.
Is this an issue we ought to be addressing and dealing with, which is the excessive spending we have, the borrowing that we're doing, the fiscal challenge, and I realize there are two parts of a fiscal challenge, tax revenue as well as spending. But is this something we ought to make an urgent priority? I saw one group, a nonpartisan group in the House called the No Labels Group. They've said, hey, let's just get a commission together to talk about how we can restrain spending. Isn't this something we ought to be talking about as opposed to just pointing at each other and saying, you're to blame, no, you're to blame, and the debt went higher under Trump. No, it didn't, it went higher under, it's like, guys, solve the problem. Don't just hit each other with brick bats. Is this a challenge we got to deal with?
I mean, Erskine Bowles years ago said this is going to be the most predictable economic crisis in history. Again, we're on pace by the CBO to borrow $114 trillion over the next 30 years under the rosy scenario of peace, prosperity, low interest rates, no new spending, no new tax cuts. $114 trillion. Who's going to lend us $114 trillion? China and Japan have already reduced their holdings to $2 trillion. The Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion. They're not going to monetize it. So are we really going to borrow $100 trillion from domestic investors over the next 100 years? And if we do so, what's going to happen to interest rates in the economy? If Congress doesn't deal with this, the bond market will cut us off at some point, and then it's going to be much more painful.
Senator Mitt Romney, Republican from Utah, questioning witness Brian Riedel, Manhattan Institute Senior Budget, Tax, and Economics Fellow, also a former chief economist, to former Senator Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio. Part of today's Senate Budget Committee hearing on the House-passed bill dealing with the debt ceiling and spending cuts. C-SPAN covered it all. You can find the video at cspan.org. An article at the Washington Post on the White House position of not wanting to combine those two issues in one bill writes Biden officials had hoped they could win in part with the backing of powerful Washington allies outside the government, including establishment Republicans, the business lobby, and nonpartisan budget hawks that have traditionally warned against default. At least so far, however, these key constituencies have not rallied to the White House's side, instead urging an agreement, any agreement in some cases, to get the debt ceiling raised before the government runs out of maneuvering room to head off a crisis. That from the Washington Post. The White House Budget Director, Shalanda Young, speaking today with reporters in the White House briefing room ahead of next Tuesday's meeting with President Biden and the invited bipartisan congressional leaders to discuss the debt ceiling issue.
you've laid out the stakes pretty clearly here, but so far no one seems to be budging. So I wonder, especially given, the clock really ticking at this point, we are just a few weeks away, at what point do you start planning for default to actually happen? Have those plans already started? Are you talking with companies?
Look, we believe, and this might be Shalonda the optimist, and I've worked with a lot of those members of Congress in my nearly 15 years on the Hill. They all know the devastating results default. Many of them were around in 2011 when our full faith and credit was reduced. And so I have hope that we will find a path to avoid default. But it's our job to keep coming to you, go to the American people, and make sure people understand what this debate is about. It's not complicated. So this is what we're doing to make sure we keep that drumbeat up. And I do believe the majority of the members of Congress know that that is the wrong path to go down. Look, we saw the partisan process play out. Now we need to pivot to a bipartisan process. That's the only thing that's going to make it to the president's desk and avoid default.
You mentioned the U.S. credit rating, which was downgraded the last time we got this close to default in 2011. How concerned are you that we could see a repeat of that the U.S. could be downgraded if this comes down to the wire, even if default is ultimately avoided?
Like you heard Corinne talk about our economist report. Clearly, any of those things should concern any American. They're going to be paying more for loans in this country. It's going to take their cost of living any higher. Of course we're concerned. We're calling on the reasonable people in this town to do the right thing. Look, a bill tomorrow. This is what we don't talk about. Congress could put a bill on the floor tomorrow. Avoid default. The D.C. drama, the political brinksmanship, that's what that is. Nothing is preventing Congress from moving to avoid default. And they need to do that, whether it's tomorrow or next week.
Shalanda Young is the director of OMB, the White House Office of Management and Budget, at a news conference today in the White House briefing room. The U.S. House of Representatives is not in session in Washington, D.C. this week. Republican Congressman Rudy Kiger of Indiana did an interview today with South Bend TV station WNDU.
This seems like a no-win situation. Negotiations seem impossible. How can we find middle ground between the White House saying raising the debt ceiling should have no strings attached and House Republicans who want to cut spending no matter what?
Well, I think as you've seen in the last 2 weeks, House Republicans are the only ones who have actually done their job in Washington. We have passed a debt ceiling package out of the House. We've sent it over to the Senate. And what we've been saying for the last 90 days is that we should negotiate with each other. The American people expect us to negotiate with each other. There's historic precedent for us doing that most of the time when we have a debt ceiling coming up. And so we've asked the president to do just that.
And some of the topics, though, are things that they say Democrats will never agree to.
Well, that's why we should negotiate. And finally, what we've seen from the president here in the last few days is he's called the leaders of the House and the Senate to the White House. That meeting is going to take place next week, and I'm hopeful that they'll be able to come together, negotiate a package that's good for the American people, that helps restore fiscal responsibility to Washington and gets inflation under control.
Now, I have to ask, several military and veteran organizations have asked the GOP budget bill not be passed unless there are protections for the VA included, but they weren't. Should veterans be worried about this?
No, they shouldn't. And I actually signed on to a letter earlier this week to the Secretary of the VA asking them to stop using veterans as a political pawn, to stop misleading veterans over what the potential consequences to them would be. And so from our perspective, there are over 60 veterans on the House Republican side. We have said very plainly, including our Veterans Affairs Committee Chair Mike Bost, has said very plainly that we will not allow cuts to veterans' benefits, period, end of story. They've earned those benefits, and we intend to make sure that we deliver on that.
Should those protections be in writing, though?
Well, we're happy to put them in writing, and we've said that we would certainly do that through the appropriations process.
Congressman Rudy Kiger, Republican from Indiana, this morning on WNDU TV in South Bend. The Chinese government-owned news site Xinhua writes, the entrenched U.S. debt problem has once again drawn global attention, as U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently warned the U.S. government could default as soon as June 1st if the debt ceiling isn't addressed without timely action by the Congress, currently at an impasse amid partisan fights. The U.S. government would be unable to pay its bills, which would potentially cripple the U.S. economy and threaten global financial stability. That from the Chinese government news site. On Capitol Hill in Washington, Senator Jack Reed, Democrat from Rhode Island, chair of the Armed Services Committee, asked the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, about the worldwide consequences of the U.S. defaulting on its debt.
Secretary Yellen indicated that we will exceed the debt limit by June 1st, requiring action before that. Have the intelligence community assessed the international consequences of default on our debt?
Thank you, Chairman. We don't have certainty on the outcome of the financial markets, nor of countries' opinions of sort of economic and political leadership that might be affected by a default on the debt. But I would say that what our assessment is that regardless of its duration, of a default's duration, almost certainly it would create global uncertainty about the value of the U.S. dollar and U.S. institutions and leadership, leading to volatility in currency and financial markets and commodity markets that are priced in dollars. And that's basically as far as our analysts are able to provide.
A follow-up is, and you might want to take this for the closed session also, but our adversaries, I would presume, would want to exploit any type of difficulty that we have. Do we have any indications that China in particular is preparing for exploitation of this, either through disinformation in the United States or through financial or other moves?
So I don't have any information that suggests that they're planning for that, but I think our analysts would agree with you that it would be, almost a certainty that they would look to take advantage of the opportunity, and they generally, both Russia and China, would look to perceive, sort of narrate through information operations such an event as demonstrating the chaos within the United States that we're not capable of functioning as a democracy, and sort of the governance issues associated with it. They've done that on a range of things.
Avril Haines is Director of National Intelligence, testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee. The questions from the chair, Jack Reed, a Democrat from Rhode Island. A headline at CNBC, stocks close lower for a fourth day on renewed bank worries. Dow goes negative for 2023. And the Dow was down 286, NASDAQ down 58, S&P down 29. Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, has introduced a bill that would raise the federal minimum wage to $17 per hour from the current $7.25, where it has been since 2008. Senator Sanders was joined at a news conference on the U.S. Capitol grounds by workers and labor union leaders.
The reason that we are assembled here this morning is not complicated. In the year 2023, in the richest country in the history of the world, nobody should be forced to work for starvation wages. That's not a radical idea. If you work 40, 50 hours a week, you should not be living in poverty. It is time to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And as chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee, that is exactly what I intend to see happen. Today in America, it is unacceptable that while the richest people become much richer, over 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. And everybody up here, I grew up in a family that lived paycheck to paycheck. Everybody here knows what that means. Your car breaks down, your kid gets sick, you're suddenly in a financial disaster. This should not be happening in America. Let us be clear, and I don't think there's any debate about this. Nobody in this country can survive on $7.25 an hour. And maybe some of my colleagues in Congress might want to live for a month on $7.25 an hour and see what that's like. You can't make it on $9 an hour. You can't do it on $12 an hour. We need an economy in which all of our workers earn a living wage. It is not acceptable today that nearly 35 million American workers earn less than $17 an hour.
Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, and as he mentioned, chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee at a news conference today on the U.S. Capitol grounds. Business Insider writes that Senator Sanders has long pushed for a higher federal minimum wage, although he's been more recently stymied by centrist Democrats. His most recent attempt was to include a $15 minimum wage as part of President Joe Biden's 2021 stimulus package, although that provision was eventually struck down and then voted out of contention by 8 Democrats and independents who caucus with the Democrats. A story from The Hill. Key Senate Republicans on Thursday laid out their vision for how to speed up the approval process for energy and other infrastructure projects, but also signaled a willingness to work with Democrats to get bipartisan legislation across the finish line. The new proposals from Senators Shelley Moore Capito, Republican from West Virginia, and John Barrasso, Republican from Wyoming, articulate a starting point for the GOP amid interest in working on the issue from both parties. 2 other recent proposals, a Democratic bill focusing on renewables, and Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia's introduction of his proposal from last year, have been issued in recent days. That from The Hill. Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, the minority leader, talking about this today on the Senate floor.
It's actually mind-boggling to think that in the world's most advanced economy, we simply let our critical infrastructure crumble, our skilled workers stay home, and our brightest ideas languish until radical environmentalists run out of legal challenges and unelected Washington bureaucrats decide they're finally satisfied. Thankfully, our colleagues from West Virginia and Wyoming are teaming up to introduce 2 bills that deliver real permitting reform. The Capito and Barrasso bills are designed to create a streamlined fast track for energy and infrastructure projects, set enforceable limits on bureaucratic reviews and legal challenges, and give builders certainty that changing political winds won't hamstring their projects. Unleashing American energy, harnessing American resources, and investing in the American workforce. These are the crucial priorities. And led by Senators Capito and Barrasso, Senate Republicans are on the case.
The Senate Republican Leader Mitch McConnell today on the Senate floor. Reuters writes that the White House will support Senator Joe Manchin's bill announced on Tuesday to speed energy project permits because it would help clean power companies use vast incentives in President Joe Biden's climate law, advisor John Podesta said. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Early Saturday morning, the coronation of King Charles III will take place. He became the King of the United Kingdom following the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, the UK's longest reigning monarch. C-SPAN will air the BBC's coverage of the coronation in its entirety at 4 p.m. Eastern, from the royal procession to Westminster Abbey to the official crowning of the new king. The coronation of King Charles III, Saturday at 4 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN or online at cspan.org.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. Story from NBC News. Russia claimed Thursday that the United States was behind an alleged drone attack on the Kremlin that it said was a Ukrainian attempt to assassinate President Vladimir Putin. The accusation, made without citing any evidence, comes less than 24 hours after Moscow said that it had foiled an overnight drone strike on a building that is the heart of the country's government and President Putin's residence. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov claimed Thursday that Washington had masterminded the incident. The U.S. swiftly rejected the accusation, saying it had nothing to do with it, as did Ukraine. That from NBC News. That rejection coming from John Kirby, the White House National Security Council spokesperson.
So look, I know there's been a lot of questions over the last 24 hours or so about this alleged drone attack at the Kremlin. We're still trying to gather information about what happened, and we just don't have conclusive evidence one way or the other. I know there's lots of questions, but we just don't have conclusive evidence. One thing I can tell you for certain is that the United States was not involved in this incident in any way, contrary to Mr. Peskov's lies. And that's what they are, just lies. Over the past few days, we've also seen Russia continue to launch dozens of missiles and armed drones into Ukraine, striking civilian homes and killing innocent Ukrainians, including shoppers at a supermarket. Russia is continuing to wage a brutal war against the Ukrainian people, and we're committed to continuing to support Ukraine as they defend their country from that aggression, including, as you just saw this week, with yet another package of security assistance, drawdown authority for the president.
John Kirby in the White House briefing room, part of his opening statement. After he finished that, covering several other foreign policy topics, he took reporters' questions, and the first one went back to the drone attack.
Thank you, John. So you called what Peskov said a lie just a moment ago. Could you talk a little bit about what the motivation for that could or would be, and are you
The motivation for his lies?
Yeah. Well, why would he lie about that? And are you concerned that it's the first step in an escalation as far as conflict?
Have you seen any Peskov press conferences? I won't even begin to try to estimate why that man says what he says, or what was behind that. Although I will say, from the very beginning, the Russians have been trying to paint this war as some sort of fight with the West against Russia, NATO against Russia, the United States against Russia. So it perfectly fits in his frame, the framing that President Putin has tried to label this war as, like it was some sort of existential threat to Mother Russia, and of course it's not. Russia's the aggressor here. They had diplomatic options on the table before they decided to roll across the border into Ukraine, and they ignored all those options to try to find some sort of diplomatic solution and some sort of peaceful way out of this. They decided war. They're continuing to fight that war.
And how quickly should we expect that investigation to be resolved?
What investigation?
The alleged drone incident.
We're not investigating it. I want to be clear. I said we're still looking at this. We haven't come to any conclusions one way or the other. We're going to try to learn more, but let's not label it a report or an investigation or anything like that. We're doing the best we can to try to find out what happened. But look, and that's why I pivoted in my opening statement. While I understand the interest in this, and clearly we're interested in it too, let's not lose the bigger picture here. It's not like Mr. Putin has to invent new reasons to kill innocent Ukrainians. He keeps doing it over and over and over again. Now, whether he's going to use this as some sort of pretext is up to him. But just in the last 24 hours, he's bombing shoppers at a supermarket. So the violence just continues one way or the other.
John Kirby is the Strategic Communications Coordinator for the National Security Council in the White House briefing room today. Up on Capitol Hill, Senator Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, asking the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, and the Director of the Defense Information Agency, General Scott Berrier, about Russia's claims. It was at a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing.
I'm surprised it's gotten to me, the seventh questioner, and no one's raised the fact that Russia's government has accused Ukraine of trying to assassinate President Putin and saying that the United States goaded them into it. Seems like kind of a big deal. Big if true, as the kids say today. Dr. Haines, what do you have to say about these claims from Russia's government?
Well, obviously, you've seen the Ukrainian government deny their, having engaged in this. And at this stage, we don't have information that would allow us to provide an independent assessment on this.
Okay. General Barrett?
I think it gets after Senator Sheen's comment about misinformation.
Perhaps some grounds to think that maybe these claims are exaggerated. One, do we know that Vladimir Putin doesn't spend the night at the Kremlin all that much? Is that correct, Director Haines?
Yes.
Kremlin is not like the White House, in other words. It's not the primary residence of the president of Russia. Even if you were there, these drones from the videos I've seen, they do not appear to be the size of weapons that could do significant damage to the Kremlin. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. They also appear to be the kinds of drones that would require relatively close line of sight control, which means someone on the ground in Moscow, which is not known as an open and friendly city to people who are hostile to the Russian government. Is that correct, General Barry?
Potentially from the photos that I've seen, yes.
In most attacks on Russian soil, Ukraine's government has been ambiguous or silent about responsibility for the attacks. Yet in this case, they've explicitly disclaimed any responsibility. Is that correct, Director Haines?
Yes.
All right. General Barry, I think you might have been onto something when you said that this sounds like misinformation.
Senator Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, questioning the DIA Director, General Scott Berrier, and the DNI, Avril Haines, at the Senate Armed Services Committee today. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressing the Hague site of the ICC saying we all want to see a different Vladimir here in The Hague, the one who deserves to be sentenced for these criminal actions right here in the capital of the international law. And I'm sure we will see that happen when we win, and we will win. He also pushed again for the creation of a special tribunal to prosecute Russian crimes in Ukraine, saying if we want true justice, we should not look for excuses and should not refer to the shortcomings of the current international law, but make bold decisions that will correct the shortcomings of those norms that unfortunately exist in international law. The ICC, or International Criminal Court, has issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Putin and another Russian official over war crimes charges for their alleged role in the unlawful deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia. But the ICC cannot prosecute the crime of aggression, which could hold Russian leaders accountable for the war because it lacks jurisdiction in Russia. Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court. From Associated Press, President Joe Biden signed an executive order on Thursday setting the path to sanction individuals involved in the recent violence in Sudan that's left hundreds dead and thrown the Afghan nation into chaos. The president saying in a statement that his order will hold individuals responsible for threatening the peace, security, and stability of Sudan, undermining Sudan's democratic transition, using violence against civilians, or committing serious human rights abuses. At the State Department today, spokesperson Vedant Patel with an update on U.S. efforts to help Americans in Sudan get out.
On Sudan, we have successfully completed the U.S. government-led operation involving 3 overland convoys to Port Sudan, including securing onward travel for participants in the convoy from Port Sudan. I can inform you the State Department, through a coordinated effort with the Department of Defense and allies and partners, successfully facilitated the departure from Sudan of over 2,000 individuals since the violence started, the majority of whom are U.S. citizens, as well as U.S. lawful permanent residents, locally employed staff, immediate family members, and of course nationals from allied and partner countries. We recognize the dedication and bravery of U.S. personnel, locally employed staff, and partner countries operating under difficult conditions, and we will continue to provide information for U.S. citizens in Sudan, including departure options as available as they come online. And we reiterate our warning to U.S. citizens to not travel to Sudan. With that, Matt, go ahead.
Before going on, just on the Sudan thing, when you say you successfully completed the 3 convoys, that means that everyone who was in those convoys has now left Port Sudan and they are in either Jeddah or someplace else?
They're in transit to either their onward destination, correct? Okay. They have reached or are in transit, correct?
Okay. And there are no plans at the moment for anything anymore.
Yeah, I don't have any additional convoy operations to announce. Of course, that will continue to assess security situations, but our commitment to American citizens who remain endures, and American citizens who wish to leave, we continue to reiterate them to make the U.S. government aware of their presence through the crisis intake form, and will continue to provide appropriate guidance.
State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel today at his briefing. The United Nations has warned that the people of Sudan are facing a humanitarian catastrophe. So far in the fighting, over 500 people killed, nearly 5,000 wounded, and over 300,000 Sudanese displaced. From the New York Times, the White House on Thursday pushed Silicon Valley chief executives to limit the risks of artificial intelligence in the administration's most visible effort to confront rising questions and calls to regulate the rapidly advancing technology. For more than an hour in the White House's Roosevelt Room, Vice President Kamala Harris and other officials told the leaders of Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, the maker of the popular ChatGPT chatbot, and Anthropic, an AI startup, that they have a responsibility to seriously consider concerns about the technology. President Biden also briefly stopped by the meeting, the administration said. Later, at the White House briefing, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre got some questions about the meeting and the president's visit.
The president stopped by an AI meeting today, so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about his views on AI and what he asked ChatGPT.
So I know there was questions about this, about if the president has used a ChatGPT. Yes, the president has been extensively briefed on GPT and knows how it works. So I can confirm that. I know as it relates to his thoughts, but what I want to, I haven't asked him about his thoughts on it, but look, this is something that is important to the president. This is why he has had continuing engagement on this issue. As you know, he had one very recently with PCAS, and you all got to hear a little bit from him. As it relates today, the vice president and senior administration officials convened the CEO meeting, and these CEOs lead companies at the forefront of AI innovation to underscore the president and vice president's belief that AI is one of the most powerful technologies of our time, but in order to seize the opportunities it present, we must mitigate the risk. And that's what we want to see. We want the risk mitigated, and we want the products to be safe. And so that is what you're seeing from these this engagement in particular with CEOs, but that is something that the president has certainly want to make sure that we're dealing with AI in the way that, as we know, is the most powerful technology of our time, but we have to make sure that we protect people's rights, and that's what you're seeing this administration doing.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre taking reporters' questions. The Biden administration also announcing an investment of $140 million to establish 7 new AI research institutes. Today, May 4th, is the unofficial holiday of Star Wars fans, as the movie catchphrase, "May the Force be with you," was turned into "May the 4th be with you." Last year, C-SPAN 2's Book TV interviewed Stephen Kent, the author of How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. The book is about the social, economic, and political lessons from the Star Wars movies.
George Lucas originally set out to do the original Star Wars trilogy, and he talks about this a lot as a critique of the Nixon administration and America in the post-Watergate world. When the prequels, 1999 to 2005, were coming out, he was banging the drum really hard about the War on Terror. Now, obviously, the War on Terror starts after the first prequel movie begins, 1999, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, but it all just lined up perfectly. He was warning us about a society where we give in to fear and a state, a government, that promises to keep us safe at all costs, no matter what. And then we're attacked on 9/11, and we embark on this war on terror, and George Lucas was looking at his movies and talking to people and going, "This is what I was trying to warn you about." The movies are also a combination, particularly the Jedi religion, of taking the best of Eastern and Western philosophies, particularly the Stoic faith, the Stoic philosophy, the Christian faith, and then also the Tao from the East, and looking to Eastern philosophers for guides on how to live. And the Jedi are a synthesis of all of those different philosophies.
Stephen Kent, why are you at Freedom Fest, the Libertarian Convention?
Because I'm deeply concerned about our society that has gotten to be hyper-focused on safety and freedom from fear and comfort above ideas such as being free to chart your own destiny. I think it's really important, particularly in conferences like this, to go out here and remind people that there is always going to be another fad that challenges our sensibilities, another crisis that challenges us and makes us want government to go and fix things and keep us safe, but it always comes at a cost. Star Wars is a story about that cost. Anakin Skywalker originally sets out to try to save people who he loves from dying, and he makes a deal with the devil. That deal leads him to become Darth Vader, suffering for the rest of his life inside a metallic suit, and also punishing the people of the galaxy for the choices that he made. This is something that we should also think about. How far are we willing to go to make things good for everybody? There will always be a cost. Darth Vader in Star Wars is my reminder of that.
Stephen Kent is the creator of a Star Wars podcast and author of How the Force Can Fix the World, interviewed by C-SPAN 2's Book TV at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas last summer. And you can find the full event on our website at cspan.org. And on this unofficial holiday of Star Wars, May 4th, may the 4th be with you. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about emailed to you every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.